Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing CBSE Class 10 Biology, Chapter 15, Our Environment. More specifically, we'll be looking at the topic food chains. Human beings and any living organism in general requires nutrition for survival. But how do we obtain this nutrition? When we consume food, nutrition is entering our body. Food is the ultimate source of energy for all living organisms. We require energy to work, grow, move around, and reproduce. So where do we find food? Obviously, if energy is such a vital essential for human beings and organisms, where do we acquire this food? The ecosystem is an interdependent relationship between living and non-living things, and we've developed a system where organisms feed off of one another. So a small organism eats a plant, and a larger organism eats the smaller animal. So through this system, we maintain ecological balance, and we sustain and thrive based on the dependence and relationship between one another. So essentially, without other organisms, people and animals can't survive. We depend on each other. Smaller organisms are being eaten by larger ones, and these larger organisms are being eaten by even larger organisms. So ultimately, it's all about size. We start off with the producers, which are plants, and they're slowly eaten by larger and larger organisms until they reach the top. But how do we represent this through a diagram or a visual? That's where food chains come into play. A food chain is a visual representation of flow of energy from one trophic level to another. So what's a trophic level? Every food chain starts with the sun, and it ends with the largest biotype. A biotype is a technical term for an organism of the same species. Trophic levels represent every step of the food chain. So all the plants make up one trophic level, small consumers make up another, and each trophic level has a specific diet and population. In this pyramid scheme, you can see all four primary trophic levels. At the bottom, we have the producers, and on top, we have primary consumers, secondary consumers, and the apex is tertiary consumers. So obviously, based on the structure of this diagram, we can determine that the producer's population is the largest, and the pinnacle or the tertiary consumer's population is the lowest. This is because in terms of size, producers are smaller if we look at leaves and small plants, and the size increases as we go up every trophic level. So food chains can be represented through this trophic level. It's a unidirectional flow of energy from the bottom to the top. And I say unidirectional because you can only go from bottom to top. The energy can't refract or come back somehow. So as I mentioned earlier, the lower levels have a higher population. Let's look at a few suitable examples of food chains. Every food chain begins with the sun. The sun is the driving force of all energy. It's fascinating to imagine that our energy and our ability to do work, grow, and reproduce comes from the sun. This is why the sun is so essential for all living organisms. So green plants and some bacteria are known as the producers, and they're able to synthesize energy from inorganic substances such as CO2, water, and chlorophyll, and they also require sunlight. So by using these raw materials, they synthesize food for themselves, and since they're able to produce their own food, they're known as autotrophs. So these plants are eaten by primary consumers, which are smallest in size. The example I've taken here is a butterfly. The butterfly is consumed by a secondary consumer, which in this case is the frog. And the food chain ends at the tertiary consumer, the largest of them all, who eats the frog. Let's look at a different example. Here the food chain is much smaller. We have the driving force, which is the sun, and we have a plant. The plants are eaten by the goat, and the goat is eaten by the tiger. So food chains can have different trophic levels. There's no specific formula or pattern. Now, what's a food web? Now, I've shown you that there's two different food chains, and both of these food chains could exist in the same ecosystem. So how can we bring all of these together? That's where a food web comes into play. It compiles multiple food chains of organisms belonging to the same biome or habitat, and it aggregates all of these to create one large scheme. It's a summary of ecosystem nutritional activities. So in this example and illustration here, you can see a simple food chain. The ultimate source of nutrition for all the heterotrophs or consumers are the green plants. And so here the green plants can be either eaten by a goat, rabbit, or a mouse. And the mouse can be eaten by either an owl or a snake. And the rabbit can be eaten by a jackal. And this goat can be either eaten by a jackal or a lion. So as you can see here, these consumers have a wide diet, and it could vary depending on the availability of the nutrition and the availability of biodiversity in that biome. So to compile all of this and aggregate this into a simple summary, we use food webs. So now let's look at another fundamental topic in the food chain, which is 10% law. So according to this law, it states that plants utilize only 1% of the sun's energy to attain nutrition. So the sun produces a vast amount of nutrition, which can't even be tapped into. The sun powers an entire galaxy, and plants, they don't consume 50% or even 100%. They only consume 1% of the sun's energy. And so this puts into picture the vast capabilities of the sun and the power of the sun. So plants only utilize 1% of the sun's energy, and they use that to synthesize energy for themselves, and they create their own food. So 90% of the energy that they produce through photosynthesis is not used to deliver to the next trophic level. It's used for their own requirements. So even the plants have to grow, reproduce, and synthesize food for the future. So 90% of the energy goes for these purposes. And only 10% is made into its own body, and 10% is reserved for the next trophic level. So if we look back at our food chain example, the butterfly or the goats will only consume 10% of the plant's total energy. And this applies for the consumers as well. So the goat, it uses 90% of the energy that it consumes from the plants, and the 90% of energy is utilized for work, growth, and reproduction. And 10% is given to the next trophic level. So through this we can determine that very little usable energy is available for the next trophic level, because 10%, it's decreasing every single time. And that's why food chains don't have 10 or 12 trophic levels. They're only limited to 3 or 4. And a smaller food chain is more efficient and effective than a larger food chain, because more energy is being preserved, and the concentration of pesticides and chemicals is lower. But that's another topic called biomagnification, which I also explain, and I'll leave the links for that video in the description box below. So 10% law states that only 10% of the energy consumed is made available for the next level of the food chain. So that concludes this video on food chains and food webs. I hope you had a thorough, in-depth explanation. Be sure to stay tuned to the channel for more concept overview videos. And until the next one, this is Ch.15 signing off. Peace.